The Australian Financial Review.
The Financial Review's Rear Window column has had a very busy 2025.
We're constantly on the lookout for people doing and saying one thing publicly and then privately doing and saying something else.
From jet-setting billionaires, bank CEOs behaving badly, and the love lives of executives being forced out into the open, there's been plenty for Mark Stefano and Hannah Wootton to write about.
We sort of did end up having quite the focus on what some of these people were getting up to in their personal lives, but that's because of how it veered into their professional lives.
As much as there's been a lot of fun this year about the Coldplay kiss cam or any of these other stories, transparency and public scrutiny can be the best disinfectant for these things.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, in the last episode of the year, we're joined by Rear Window's fearless and very dynamic duo to look back on the action-packed year that was and ahead to what 2026 might bring. It's Tuesday, December 23. Hi, Mark. Hi, Hannah. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
Mark, when I asked you what you wanted to talk about in this episode, looking back over 2025, your response was hypocrites. Tell us why 2025 was the year of the hypocrites.
Well, I think that 2025 stood out just a bit more than usual because our remit on Rear Window is to almost be the heat-seeking missile of the Financial Review, seeking out hypocrisy wherever it is. And we just kept finding
I like that, heat-seeking missile.
That's right. We're constantly on the lookout for people doing and saying one thing publicly and then privately doing and saying something else. And there's been no shortage of that in corporate Australia and in politics over the last 12 months. And as columnists, it's very sort of freeing that we get a little bit more latitude than other parts of the paper to cut through some of the BS and euphemism that protects a lot of the hypocrisy that the CEOs, the board directors, the politicians really can rely on to hide.
They can't hide from you.
Hopefully not.
And Hannah, who were the biggest hypocrites?
So there's competition to be on top of that podium, but I would definitely give the gold to Andrew Forrest. So Twiggy is the founder of Fortescue.
My company, Fortescue Future Industries, and myself, my family, everyone I know really believe.
It's one of the biggest iron ore companies in Australia and the world.
Australia is on the cusp of becoming a renewable energy superpower.
He also likes to see himself anyway as the world's biggest green saviour.
With billionaire mining magnate Andrew Forrest committing millions to projects and promoting green hydrogen globally.
He was on the cover of February's Time magazine as the planet's unlikely ally. At the same time, he's travelling the country and the world in his private jet.
He announced a major company restructure
and pulling back on all the company's investments in green hydrogen.
And 700 job cuts, which could put a big dent in the green hydrogen promise.
So, in the middle of the year, he wrote off $244 million in clean energy spending. There's a whole host of governments he is now taking funding from to try and get these projects off the ground. He's halted about $1 billion in green hydrogen projects. And not only is he telling us he's saving the world, but then partway through the year, all the records of these halted projects mysteriously disappeared off Fortescue's website, which was convenient. Even looking at his private jet, we actually ran the numbers on how far it had travelled and what the emissions would be from that. And they were just mammoth. So, the hypocrisy there, it's not just his business, but his personal travel seems to come at a pretty big environmental cost.
And he wasn't the only billionaire who was caught on a private jet over the past year, was he?
And we talk about Twiggy Forrest being a recurring character in Rear Window over many years, and another person who has been is the Atlassian founder, Mike Cannon-Brookes. And obviously, one thing everybody knows about him is he's Mr. Climate Conscious. He goes around giving lectures about making sure corporate Australia are doing enough to bring down emissions. And it really typified the year that there was a random Wednesday afternoon that I got a text message from a source saying, you won't believe it, but Mike Cannon-Brookes has bought a private jet. When I actually got the tip and the text message came through, it was the realization that the tail number of the private jet matched his birthday, that then I knew it was his. And over a few hours, we confirmed it. We published a story showing that of all the people in corporate Australia to buy a big mammoth gas-guzzling private jet, Mike Cannon-Brookes had done it.
He was the most unlikely.
He was the most unlikely, and it does really go to this idea that while a lot of the lectures and a lot of the sermons that come from these big billionaires who are telling us one thing and then in their private lives thinking, well, for them, it's different. And it really was symbolised by Cannon-Brookes, who at the start of the year had bought an F1 team. That raised a few eyebrows. And then when we did break the story that he had bought this private jet, it came in the context of a really interesting and troubling year for Atlassian and for Cannon-Brookes, who had to sack some employees. So it was one of those stories that really stood out as a classic Rear Window item where we were telling everybody what this amazing saviour who tells everyone what to do with regards to climate is doing in his spare time.
I think even if you look further at the sort of hypocrisy element, you have Mike Cannon-Brookes, who's, jetting to his various sporting commitments across the globe. On one of those trips, we later learnt
the jobs are to be cut from Atlassian, the Sydney-based global software success story that's made billionaires of its local founders.
That he sacked a whole host of his staff via a pre-recorded message,
springing the news on 150 staff that they would be laid off and replaced, in large measure, with artificial intelligence.
You'd think if, he had the company jet, you could drop by the office for it.
So downstream from Donald Trump being the most powerful man in the world, he sets the tone at the top with regards to what actually is important and what isn't important. And he has taken a massive whack at the ESG complex. So I think what we're seeing now is a lot of these promises and a lot of these goals that we were told that we needed to really focus on over the last decade are starting to dissipate. And what we're seeing now is whether the Cannon-Brookes and the Twiggy Forrests of the world really do stand by these very lofty ideals, or whether it all actually just turned out to be a bit of bulldust.
Mark, when we did this episode with Miriam Robin, your former co-columnist last year, we spent a lot of time talking about WiseTech and MinRes and the fall from grace of Richard White and Chris Ellison. You were particularly involved in that MinRes story. But really, those were also the big stories of this year.
Yeah, and it's really pivoted these stories. At the end of 2024, Richard White at WiseTech and Chris Ellison at MinRes were on their knees, and the big, large shareholders had gotten their way. In the case of Richard White and WiseTech, it's a bit of a sordid LinkedIn sex scandal. In the case of MinRes and Chris Ellison, it's much more to do with misusing company resources. But over the course of the year, they've almost both returned and had their vengeance on the boards. Now, it's important to remember both Richard White and Chris Ellison are the largest individual shareholders of their companies. So when they do return, they actually have the heft of others around him and they have the heft of the shareholder register. But at the end of 2025, what you actually see is Richard White almost holding hostage the future of WiseTech.
Federal police and government regulators have raided the offices of one of Australia's biggest tech companies, WiseTech.
Because there was an AFP raid on the Sydney offices, which really rattled the company.
In relation to a suspected insider trading plot.
And it should sort of send a signal to all the shareholders, not just at WiseTech, but at MinRes, about what happens when if you let the founder, the charismatic person back in the room with all of these skeletons in their closets, it could well be the authorities make the decision for you instead of actually moving past these moments for the company. It comes down to the authorities and it comes down to shareholders to say enough is enough. And as we enter into 2026, enough is not enough yet.
Hannah, another big story this year started with an explosive all-staff email. It was sent to more than 900 current and former Slater and Gordon employees in February. was also sent to you, and it was brutal in its criticism of the law firm, its key executives, and its private equity owners. But probably more importantly, it made public the pay packets of its staff. You got the email, as I said. So how did you break the story, Hannah?
Someone forwarded this email through. I quickly set to work trying to verify within that the pay details and the like were correct. Very quickly established that they were. That turned out to be one of the biggest stories in the professional services sector this year, which is one of those sort of parts of the business world where there's always huge demand for scrutiny over what they're doing because, you know, as important as all the listed companies are, what's just as important are sort of the law firms, the consultants, the auditors that advise them. So in this one, there was a real element of kind of whodunit, who was behind the email. It's like pretty accepted now that it was not, in fact, from the person who it was signed off by.
Mm-hmm.
Our colleague, Max Shanahan, did a really good job of tracking down the person who appears to have been behind it, who was a sort of disgruntled former human resources manager or the like in that team.
Mm-hmm.
But the bigger point of that story was how 3 years after the PwC scandal, that sector is already facing so much more scrutiny. So I think the thing with the Slater's case is it kind of shows how these organisations are run
Mm-hmm.
are really actually important to the wider economy. So there's the importance of culture. Obviously, to get to a point where your pay is leaked for everyone, you've got some cultural issues and you're going to have more after everyone's been told what their colleagues are paid and what their bonuses were. Slater's is the sort of original workers' comp firm. It's the one that's meant to look after its staff more than anyone because they make their money from going after employers who haven't done the same thing. And, you know, their main rival, Maurice Blackburn, now has several cases on foot against Slater and Gordon on behalf of their former staff. So it really does tie back to that hypocrisy too.
Mark, we had new CEOs at 3 of the big 4 banks this year. They all made headlines for very different reasons. Why did the bank bosses feature so prominently in Rear Window?
Because they're so much fun. I tell you what, there's nothing better than having not just one new CEO in a very, very important ASX bank, but you have 3 at the same time, and they're almost like beautifully drawn characters in a show because they've got such defining characteristics. Obviously, a lot of the attention has been on ANZ's decision to hire Nuno Matos from Portugal. This is a man who looks like the Javier Bardem of banking, wears a 3-piece suit, has a chiseled jaw.
Some people say George Clooney.
George Clooney, the Antonio Banderas of banking. You know, we've had a lot of fun with Nuno over the last year.
In from Portugal with a 3-piece suit and an axe.
And one of the things that he has done is try to immediately stamp his authority on a bank that really does need it.
Savage job cuts delivered by brand new CEO Nuno Matos.
ANZ has spent the last few years fishtailing from scandal to scandal.
Time and time again, ANZ has fallen short.
Overcharging their customers, you know, mispricing bonds in an auction.
Time and time again, ANZ has betrayed the trust of Australians.
And then ASIC, obviously, at the end of 2025, got one of the largest ASIC fines in history against ANZ. And in the background to all of this, Nuno, or sometimes we call him the Portuguese prince, has decided he's going to embark on one of the largest cost-cutting drives in banking history.
ANZ is axing almost 10% of its workforce,
sacking more than 3,000 bankers.
But the boss of Australia's most profitable bank claims the move isn't about profits.
So for us, it's a rich vein of stories. But then you look across the way and you've got Andrew Irvine, who's the new CEO of NAB, not necessarily on the front page or not necessarily, you know, taking up a lot of column inches until this year because he is the master of the long lunch. He's the master of being able to take his business clients out for a great 1 p.m. till 5 p.m. lunch session. And he really did stamp his authority on the business bank over several years. And that is the NAB's bread and butter. But earlier this year, we found out that this sort of long lunching had become so eyebrow-raising to several investors that it was raised with the chairman of NAB, Phil Cronican. So we broke that story. And then the third guy who was in our sights was Anthony Miller, who's just recently taken on Westpac. Now, he's ex-Goldman Sachs. Again, if you imagine in your mind a former Goldman Sachs banker, a former rugby-looking guy, really alpha dog, and our colleague, Angira Bharadwaj, wrote this year that he was telling everyone that he actually worked on Christmas Day. That's how much he's committed to work. And that scares people when they find out that the CEO is so committed to work that they have to work on Christmas, that he actually has to come out and try to explain it away and say, no, I didn't mean that. I meant that on Christmas I spoke to my father over Christmas lunch, and that was my quote-unquote work for the day. He held a town hall at the end of 2025 to clarify to everyone, don't worry, guys, I'm not working on Christmas.
So Andrew Irvine was having too much fun and Anthony Miller was working too hard.
And in banking, both those things are problems, apparently.
And I'm going to jump in there just to say that it's hard to hear this and not think about the fact that everyone we've discussed so far are men, but I think it reflects two things. The first is that often in Rear Window, we're looking at the people who are at the top of companies, of politics, the movers and shakers in these circles, and because of a whole bunch of historic and systemic reasons that, Lisa, you and I have talked about at length on this podcast before, most of the people at the top are still men. You know, we just discussed all the new Big Four bank CEOs. It beggars belief that none of them could find a woman. But then the other aspect of that is the column looks at people behaving badly. And I say without any further comment that the people behaving badly have been men. Speaking of people behaving badly, there are a lot of inappropriate relationships that found their way into Rear Window this year. We sort of did end up having quite the focus on what some of these people were getting up to in their personal lives, but that's because of how it veered into their professional lives. So, yeah, in a way, Mark and I joked that this year we became the shag police.
We're reviewing the year with Rear Window columnists Mark Stefano and Hannah Wootton. Hannah, one of the viral moments of the year was the Coldplay kiss cam moment that caught out a US tech executive, and it really went around the world in terms of the fallout. Your column too unearthed several inappropriate relationships. What was it about this year?
Yeah, it was certainly a theme of the year, which we should have picked right from the start, because when Mark and I were still both on leave in early January, Twitter blew up with a photo of a penis that had found its way onto Luke Sayers' Twitter feed. Listeners will know Luke as Carlton Football Club president, but more significantly a former CEO of PwC and then the founder of his own consulting firm, Sayers Group. At the time, though, he was Carlton president, and an executive of one of Carlton's main sponsors, Bupa, was tagged in the post. Luke was insistent from the start. He didn't post the image. An AFL investigation backed that up, but he still resigned from the Carlton presidency. There were also sort of flow-on effects for Sayers Group. It actually had to rebrand. He started taking sort of a backseat role. And the interesting thing with this was that Sayers is no stranger to the corporate world scandal. So he was CEO of PwC when the actual tax leaks issues were happening. So not when it was out in the media, but when that actual misconduct was occurring. Yet somehow he sort of skated through that. He actually earned the nickname Mr. Teflon because nothing stuck. And I said to someone at the time that it's almost kind of boring that there were so many more significant scandals that skirted around this person. And in the end, what led to him at least temporarily coming undone was just a dick pic.
It really did set the tone, though, for a year where every few months we'd be writing about a relationship that maybe had been disclosed in private, but in public, once a bit of scrutiny attaches to it, things can quickly spin out of control. So I'm thinking at the start of the year, Macquarie Capital, which is the investment banking division of the ASX-listed Macquarie, we wrote that the guy who's the head Asia boss, Tim Joyce, was in a relationship with the head of equity capital markets, Georgina Johnson. And I remember at the time Macquarie saying to me, why are you feeling the need to write about this? But I was being told by my sources within the organisation that the culture of the bank was really being affected by this relationship and some of the reporting lines. And at the end of this year, Georgina has moved out to Goldman Sachs. There's been a couple of other really high-profile departures. And there are real questions about Tim Joyce's further leadership of the bank. There was the case of super retail. Anthony Heraty was the CEO at the start of 2025, isn't at the end because he was having a relationship with a senior HR person. And the board of super retail stuck by him when this was first being reported and then chucked him on the funeral pyre around August. So I think that there's nuance here because obviously we're 8 years along from the cultural shift that happened after Me Too. And we're now having very serious discussions about what is acceptable workplace behaviour. There seems to be conversations that are happening about who can be in relationships with who at these types of companies or institutions, and whether a CEO should be allowed to be having a relationship with anyone on staff. Hannah and I think about these issues a lot. It's not just doing drive-bys on certain people and pointing and saying, oh my God, these people are shagging or these people are together. I think it's a really interesting dynamic about what these relationships can do to a culture of an organisation, especially when people are getting overlooked for promotions or getting favouritism in the workplace. So we think that as much as there's been a lot of fun this year about the Coldplay kiss cam or any of these other stories, transparency and public scrutiny can be the best disinfectant for these things.
Mark, one of the biggest stories in the lead up to the election, because remember we did have an election this year, came out of Rear Window. Tell us how you came to write about Peter Dutton's ill-timed star turn at a fundraiser hosted by Sydney pub baron Justin Hems.
At the time, Cyclone Alfred was bearing down on the coast of Queensland, and Peter Dutton, I think he was really affected by Donald Trump. That really affected his election chances. So in the first few weeks of the campaign, as Cyclone Alfred bore down on his electorate, the most important thing in this is it's his electorate of Dixon that was right in the eye of the storm. He ducked out of a cyclone briefing and made a secret trip to Justin Hems' Harbourside Mansion in Sydney. He then popped up a day later back in Brisbane, but I had been told that he had attended this event and I went about trying to confirm it and stand it up. When we eventually did publish the story that he had snuck out of his electorate for a night to hang out with some of the richest people in Sydney, it ballooned into a multi-day, multi-week story where people were questioning whether Peter Dutton's political antenna was fixed on straight. So it was a real political miscalculation for Dutton, and it really summed up that comedy of errors that he engaged in for most of the election campaign.
And I remember you saying that you realised it was a bigger story than you thought when people were so cagey about talking about where he was.
That's right. Usually if you call Peter Dutton's office and say, where was the opposition leader on a certain time, they'll be able to be a bit forthright, but they really went to ground and stopped answering my phone calls, and even my text messages went unanswered. So you don't have confirmation when people are stonewalling you, but it does make you think that you're onto something.
You're onto something. So a final question for both of you then. If 2025 was the year of hypocrites and love scandals, what can we expect from 2026?
I think next year we can expect a lot more scrutiny on the actual performance of some of the people we've discussed today. By that I mean the new Big Four bank CEOs. They've had a bit of a grace period, but what will happen next year is it will be about shareholders saying, is your plan working? Am I getting value out of these cuts? How do you challenge CBA? Then also on honeymoon periods, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will hopefully, for him and Jodi's sake, get a proper honeymoon at some point. But as far as political ones go, he kind of did get a second grace period at the start of the new term just because of how thumping his victory in May was. There's going to be a lot more scrutiny there.
There are two things that I'm looking into 2026 as possible pressure points. I think that the overpromise of AI is starting to look a bit thin on the ground, especially to do with companies who've signed multi-billion-dollar agreements with these tech saviors who are going to lead to all these efficiencies, but where the hell are they? I think that the government's signing a huge deal with OpenAI was really, really a big deal that people haven't really stopped and thought about because OpenAI isn't the only AI company in the world. And then the second thing is I think events play such a big role with regards to how we go about our everyday life as journalists. And I'm looking to see how big CEOs or big name politicians, how they react to certain events and deal with pressure. Because ultimately, that's where the stories come from. It's about people and institutions who have to deal with very thorny problems and tough decisions. And often when they don't actually deal with them properly, that's where Rear Window, people like me and Hannah come in with stories.
And heat-seeking missiles.
And heat-seeking missiles will be launching.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Rear Window columnist Mark Stefano and Hannah Wootton joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coulin and Alex Gow. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend as it helps others find us, and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. The Fin is taking a short break. We wish you all the very best over the holidays and take the opportunity to binge some old episodes of The Fin that you may have missed. We'll be back with a new episode on January 22. See you then.
The Australian Financial Review.